Okay.
Okay.
I see familiar faces here. Cornelia, Dr. Shelley Evans, Lindsay, Olga, Anton. Let's see. And some of these others I have not met yet, but if I haven't met you, I just wanted to send a warm greetings from Laguna Beach, California. I'm associated through this group, mostly through the Conference on the Physics, Chemistry, and Biology of Water. It's kind of like this pool of research. So we're all happy to be here together. Okay, so should I kind of take us through the presentation, Serge?
Yes, please start.
Okay, so I'm going to do a bunch of screen sharing. It's going to be partially, informal, and then it'll start to get formal and more scientific as it moves on through the presentation. The thing is, so a lot of people know me from the conference and they don't know me personally or some of my more like esoteric research. So I'm going to try to give you like a background history for like 20 minutes. That'll kind of give you, my pathway of kind of waking up into the arts, the sciences, and philosophy. And then it'll get really scientific really quick when we jump in here to discuss the recent results from the Water Peace Project collaboration with AquaPsy and Cybertronica Research, where we did a live crowdsourcing online experiment to measure the conscious observer effect during a water ceremony. It was really beautiful. And yeah, I think that'll kind of give us a pathway to understanding some context of where I've come from. Okay, so here we go. Let me do some screen sharing. Okay, you guys can see that right there? Okay, cool. And everybody's muted, and I'll just look for Serge for thumbs up if anything's different or to moderate. Okay. So yeah, so we're looking here at about a 3-part presentation, 20 minutes background and journey, how I got here. We'll do a 30-minute presentation on water-related discoveries and neurocognitive technologies, predominantly around EIS. I have an obscure pathway in crystallography that I probably will be disseminating sometime in the future. I can touch upon that very quickly. And then we'll have 10 minutes of question and answer type discussion. And if, I don't know if we can go long, we might stay a little bit longer because I know once we get into the EIS conversation, the questions and answers can get a bit expansive. So my name is Jeremy Pfeiffer. I'm from Laguna Beach, California. My personal identity is really under SVP Water Research. Sympathetic vibratory physics is what SVP stands for. You can reach me at 369@svpwaterresearch.com, and you can also explore some of my work. Currently, I'm doing a lot of stuff with crystallography and plasma research, mostly focused around resonance-based heterodyning methodologies applied towards technologies to innovate and work towards technologies for wastewater remediation. So I'm using plasma and resonance and different types of things to be able to clean water. So going back to the beginning, I went through kind of an awakening in the late 2000s. I really put a lot of time into Qigong practice. I was doing Bagua Feng Shui 5-element form. And I was waking up when I was coming out of these practices, seeing energy coming off of people. And it wasn't anything too crazy. The energy coming off people was more like the energy you see coming off the cement at a distance on a very hot day on a road. Heat coming off of that. So that's kind of what it looked like. And I was really starting to awaken and wondering what all this meant. Doing a lot of researching like we all did in that time. A lot of people were waking up kind of right there leading into 2012. And so I got into standing wave phenomena and vibration phenomena. So I got really, really good at creating resonance-based equilibrium experiments and creating really dynamic balanced experiments where a wave expression would be expressing itself in really interesting geometries and also specific angles of incidence and things like that. And so I really saw that the need to really start extrapolating the vibration work. So I taught myself, sacred geometry, in terms of some of the old school ways of Pythagoras and Apollonius of Tyana, which were some of the original, measurement systems from way back from, I guess, Atlantis and even into Egypt. And so I was really kind of like, filling my toolbox with some original type methodologies to create a measurement system based off of what we know as the music of the spheres. And so there was these overlappings where I noticed that the angles and all the geometries were perfect overlays on these standing wave functions. So, you know, I explored that and how it related to cosmological cycles, lunar cycles and things like that. And it was just quite fascinating for me. I just kind of fell in love with it and kept diving deeper and deeper. And I just getting more and more into the esoterics, and my intuition and my awakening just kept getting stronger and stronger. About that time, my friend Lindsay Kemp was reaching out to me. I was working at a local water store who was using like Schauberger methodologies to basically clean municipal water and serve it for drinking water to the local public. And so she saw, I think she went in there to say hi because she was interested in what they were doing, and she saw my vibration work on the wall. And I know she noticed that it seemed a lot like a water crystal, and she was working with the Emoto Foundation at the time and also building out her program, the Water Peace Project. And so she reached out to me. She brought me into her inner circle with Dr. Emoto and Kumanga. And we basically kind of explored, you know, how to disseminate Dr. Masaru Emoto's crystallography experiments to a greater audience. And we quickly, or I quickly kind of came to the realization that some of his best work was actually done with ceremony and indigenous wisdom and elders to basically communicate the messages of water to a greater audience. So for me, I learned a lot insight on the crystallography he was doing, but really what touched me the most was the water ceremony. And we got busy and we did our own ceremonies with him, and we really applied what we were learning, and I still do to this day. Around the same time, I was still looking for a stronger understanding of the etheric sciences. I was just really attracted to the late 18th century occult theosophy sciences. And so also ways to understand how I could match that with exploring the crystallography work with Emoto, and how do I actually start to understand these ideas of mind force and how the mind can actually make an effect on a crystallography experiment. And lo and behold, you know, I was matched up with Dale Pond at the Pond Science Institute. You can see me there in the middle. There's a dinosphere here in the foreground. And essentially Dale is the guy who basically took all of that late 18th century science and, you know, created a whole compendium and amassed it into a Wikipedia, and really, you know, has spent the last 35 years, maybe even 40 years now, exploring the work of Nikola Tesla, John Worrell Keely, and also Walter Russell, but mostly based around the work of John Worrell Keely. And John Worrell Keely was essentially building etheric devices where he was looking for a replacement for steam in the late 18th century at the time. And what he found was he was disassociating, you know, water using electrostatic forces and also geomancy to actually increase additive synthesis and amplitude of force to actually disassociate the water molecule. And he found that he was building like these analog devices that we would say nowadays are more like frequency generators, but he would create these Chladni plates or these wave plates. And so he was able to literally disassociate what he would say hydrogen into higher and higher aliquot parts, much like you would see in modes of vibration or harmonic type modal analysis phenomena. And so it got to the point where he was actually able to control these higher and higher states of ether with his mind. So supposedly he was able to control devices with his mind and things like that. There's been a lot of pushback on if Keely was real or not, but when you really get down to it and you do the research like I have, I know exactly what he was doing now, and I'm applying it present day. And some of the technology is quite disruptive. And I'll get into a little bit, touch upon that maybe a little bit later in the presentation. You can also go to the Library of Congress and learn a little bit more. There's like hundreds and hundreds of articles about him. Some of it's the classical yellow journalism, but some of it actually are really strong articles that support some of the eyewitness accounts of what he was doing. He was also very well written about by Rudolf Steiner and also Helena Madame Blavatsky. And so there's quite a background with Keely and some of the, you know, the deep occult sciences that are just kind of, you know, hidden from the public. A lot of his devices actually were dispersed throughout the world, and still to this day they're hidden and occulted within certain ownerships. So I apprenticed under Dale Pond, learned how to you know, build dinospheres, learn the working principles. It all came down to like what I was learning with those standing wave functions that I was extrapolating. it's all about understanding modes of vibration and the wave function. And really what modes of vibration are, it's basically, you know, the angles of incidence that basically bring a system together to assimilate or express itself or actually find an equilibrium. And how we'll explore that later on with electrochemistry, those are charge dynamics that are expressed between boundary conditions within the fourth phase, you could say. So you have a boundary condition, and then there's charge dynamics that are dispersed within those bands, those bandwidths. Present day Dynasphere, they're actually tuned analog, just much like a piano tuner would account for partials, tertiary, secondary and tertiary harmonics. Once you line up all of the harmonics within the system, it's graduated, and then the system is in resonance with itself. I got invited by Lindsay. She was working on bringing Dr. Masaru Emoto to the water conference, and he wasn't able to make it that year, 2013, conference on the physics, chemistry, and biology of water, chaired by Gerald H. Pollack. So she brought me along as a sidekick, and I was really lucky because that opened up a whole new world to me. And it actually kind of opened up my eyes that there were these cogent academic scientific researchers that were PhDs and leaders in industry that were like kind of on the edge. They were like, you know, kind of the black sheep themselves. And so people like me and people like them were coming together, and we were starting to create our own boundary condition. And if anybody knows anything about, you know, permaculture or any kind of like biodynamic or reforestation, anytime you have a forest gradient on the edge is where most of the dynamic life occurs. So it's those boundary conditions where the exchange of information is most expansive and abundant. So yeah, there's me presenting my poster. I had a 15 minutes to talk, and I was really scared and nervous, and I think I got the information out there. And Dr. Eshel Ben Jacob pinned me in the elevator, and he said, "Are you a scientist? Are you an artist? What are you?" And I told him, "I don't know." And he said, "Good answer." And so he started talking to me about all of the electromagnetic experiments he was doing on microbiology to create the same patterns that I was extrapolating with the wave functions that you saw earlier. So I knew there was a place for me in all of this. I was starting to find my way in confidence. 2014, I was introduced to an elite team through associates Anton Fedorenko and Serge Kernbach. And we were doing a lot of research at the time with exploring digital imprinting and homeopathy, and actually ways to detect that and quantify it. And in those early stages, I was more helping to like understand and disseminate the knowledge. And because it was some of the research was obscure from like, you know, Russian old 1980s, 70s and 80s research, you know, it was useful for me to come in and try to help, like, you know, disseminate the knowledge from a Western English speaking perspective. So I did my best. I learned a lot. I learned once again about all this obscure Russian science, and I was just fascinated, and I dove in really deep. And so that was my indoctrination into some of that great research that many people don't know about, that I think Serge has done a really good job, and the community has done a really good job at carrying on now. And so, some of the first papers were exploring, transmission of specific substances in water, and even at a distance. So we were doing stuff non-locally, we were doing stuff locally, and we were exploring electrochemical impedance spectroscopy as a way to like measure subtle super weak emissions within the water systems. And so the way I kind of understand it is we really kind of had this sense of detecting the weak fields, but characterization was such a long road ahead of us, because essentially, it's to characterize such a weak emission effect takes a lot of data. And I think, Serge can give more insight on that. And I think he spent a lot of time dialing in his algorithms to actually cancel out a lot of those noise and really find how to actually pull the information out. And I was actually able to utilize electrochemistry more conventionally to measure the effect of quartz crystal, SiO4 quartz crystal on water. And I'll explain that a little bit later. So let's see. Okay, yeah, so, spending time at the water conference, we did in 2017, in the following years, we did a lot more research into the non-local quantum effects within the macroscopic system. Serge and associates amassed many experience with electrochemical impedance spectroscopy that pretty much proved out that the experiment methodologies and the exploration and pathway towards what we were seeing in terms of the non-local effects and the quantum dynamics within the micro and macroscopic systems were actually quite valid. About that time back home in Laguna Beach, I was invited into an elite team, a think tank, a research group of 50 scientists, influencers, and researchers. It was quite private at the time, and we all kind of like had our own little passion and specialty in research. You could see a couple classic people here. There's Nassim Haramein in the middle. There's Menas Kafotos. He's a famous physicist. Here I am on the far left, and this is Robert Grant down here. He's kind of like the Bruce Wayne of this team that came together. And like, so it started really all coming together for me here because I saw a whole slew of technologies that were semi-disruptive or maybe disruptive that actually taught me that a lot of what I was learning about resonance and the wave function and the consciousness, there's actually serious applications that we could actually bring forth to the world. So learned a lot from this team. Here we are in different iterations of the team. Some of you might recognize some people in here. There's some quite extensive researchers in there. And so continuing on at the water conference, we were exploring remote consciousness. And so I was actually starting to get more and more hands-on with the technology and the devices. And I taught myself the methodologies and the experimental setups to actually apply electrochemistry. I wanted it so bad because I knew it was the holy grail, at least for what I thought was the opportunity at really starting to like quantify what I was like learning over these years and in a semi-conventional way, if not strong conventional scientific methodology. And so I did, we kind of built into that direction. And so in the later years in the conference, we were starting to really focus on remote consciousness. And that's kind of when AquaPsy was born. Anton Fedorenko in the internal research team, we were looking for ways to kind of reach a larger audience and start to like crowdsource some of our test subjects and just be able to reach out to people and explore some of these quantum dynamics and how can we actually set up a system that would support exploring consciousness using water-based sensors. And so that whole undertaking was pretty much Anton. He's a Renaissance man, does a lot of coding, great scientist, and Serge Kernbach with Cybertronica Research, pretty much powering the whole thing with the technology and the algorithms. And so he's been really supportive. Around that same time, I got invited into work with the labs at Taurus Tech, which is basically Nassim Haramein's labs for bringing resonance technologies to the public. And so I was in the background basically using electrochemistry to measure the subtle effects or weak emission effects from SiO4 quartz crystal effect on water. And it was actually fairly easy to do because SiO4 quartz is quite interesting in its properties. It is giving off a charge dynamic that is able to be picked up by EIS. So I was able to use electrochemistry to in a conventional manner to like, measure these weak emissions coming off of the crystals. Here I am at the laboratory. Eventually I worked my way up into a position where I was able to lead up the experimental validation team for all the technologies that we were exploring within the facility, not just the electrochemistry. But within here, you can see some on the right here, these little copper chambers. Boy, did we really try hard to get around that quantum entanglement effect by really kind of shielding our experiments. So we were like, the machine shop was like boring out all of these copper chambers, and we were trying all these methodologies to try to control for these experiments. And we kept finding that the conscious observer is entangled every time into the experiment, and then the water samples themselves are always entangling. So we'll get into that and how we kind of worked into those methodologies and pathways to actually find ways to control for the uncontrollable. There were certain times where we would on Fridays explore like, different types of fun things. So I would set up cymatics experiments and we would explore these standing waves and discuss how like these modes of vibration and stuff were applicable into the work that we were doing. And I'm always really interested in these conventional physics analogies that really, they lend themselves to the microscopic and macroscopic. We went and presented the research that we did with the Resonance Science group in Taurus Tech with the arc crystal effect on water. And so we put together a paper with Nassim Haramein, Scott Brown, myself, and William Brown. And once again, here's the picture of the SiO4 quartz crystal. Essentially, what's most effective about it, it's highly engineered. It's basically, it's got an XYZ axis, and there's an piezoelectric effect. There's a phonon flux coming off of the Z axis, which we were able to measure using photomultiplying tubes and spectroscopy techniques. And we were able to measure it using electrochemistry. And so you could see here over a grouping of 27 measurements, we were able to show between the control group and then the active group and the non-active group, a differentiation of effect consistently over 27 measurements. So there we were utilizing conventional methodologies with EIS to measure and quantify super weak emissions or weak emission effects. Wasn't easy because there was a lot of entanglement going on, but we figured it out. And it's still up for discussion. Okay, and then we presented also as Cybertronica Research the same year at the same conference around a lot of the research that Serge and the team have been continuing to do over the years. We've done live demonstrations at the water conference, which I think people appreciated, and we kind of were an open book in terms of some of our methodologies and exploring some of these experiments in electrochemistry. That was from that year as well, 2019. Around that same time, I was invited by a really good friend of mine who I met through that elite team and that network, Adam Curry, and he's quite a dynamic individual. He's kind of a tech genius, and he's kind of like a like a celebrity in the world of non-local remote viewing and these type of things and consciousness experiments. And he actually used diodes. He used these circuitries with wave conjugated diodes to do similar things that we're doing with electrochemistry in the conscious observer. He's doing it with circuitry. And so he invited me to present at the Contact in the Desert. I think this was 2018. And we did this live experiment with electrochemistry, and we did the conscious observer effect, and we showed a significant effect. And we later put an internal paper for the team together and explored some of the results as well as many others. So this last year at the water conference, 2019, AquaPsy had quite an opportunity to express their work. Anton actually won the poster award for his work with digital imprinting of water. We were able to get a lot of interest around what we're doing, and I think it's taken quite a years of evolution for people to really start to see wow, maybe these experiments and methodologies and some of the stuff that's a little bit harder to explain and grasp, there's something to it. And so our email list and our email threads are growing quite extensively. Some of the most world famous researchers in water on an academic level are actually conversing with Cybertronica, and it's a real exciting conversation in the background. These are my mentors and colleagues standing on the shoulders of these giants. Anton Fedorenko and Dr. Serge Kernbach. And this is our poster from this most recent year. And so where we're leading to now, essentially into the Aquaside Platform and what we're working on with the Water Peace Project and what we did with our quantifying the water ceremony that we conducted is all based around the research on Aquaside. And so really what Aquaside is it's a platform that crowdsources subjects to bring them into a place where they can actually access these water-based sensors at a distance that are in a controlled environment where they can make an effect. And so it's exploring consciousness using water-based sensors. And so let me see if I can do a quick zoom in here. So you can see essentially it's kind of a remote viewing type dynamic. If anybody's done any research into remote viewing, or even long distance healing or any of these type of things, you'll have a little bit of a background in understanding what we're talking about here. But really what you do is you log on, you can create a session for yourself. You can concentrate on a water sample that's in Germany, that's in a controlled environment in the lab, which we'll talk about shortly of those environmental controls. And you can entangle yourself and create a feedback loop, right, with this water sample. And when I say feedback loop, I'd like to use analogies. And it's much like, in the 1980s when you had your video camera and you would point it at the TV and you would see picture within picture and picture, and you would see those harmonic fractals line up. That's because there's a feedback loop building. So I believe that's an analogy for the type of feedback loop that the conscious observer has on a system. Specifically in this case, the electrochemical experiment that's happening at a distance in Germany. And to give a little bit more insight, in the electrochemical process, you're having an electrical conductivity that's building up around the electrodes. And so there's a double layer effect that's building, right? So it becomes a really sensitive fulcrum for any electrochemical changes within the system. And so as the CO2 is being absorbed from the atmosphere into the systems, the ions saturate into the water, and it becomes a really balanced fulcrum to make an effect. And so whether you're measuring super weak emissions from a crystal or digital imprinting, or you're actually working with the conscious observer effect, it's just very, very sensitive, and we're able to actually utilize that to measure super weak emissions and conscious observer. And so this is at any distance. And so from there, really, you have a live feedback of these charts here, which we'll get into shortly, that we've basically set up and made it a little bit more comprehensive for the average user. And so we've broken that down into a psi value, which is the amplitude or the magnitude of effect that's happening on the system, and a pro value, which is basically the probability that you're actually making an effect on the system. So here you can see on the left-hand side, nothing's being influenced. It's a very controlled dynamic. The environment is pretty stable, and it's characteristic of a system that's just, you know, has not been affected. And on the right-hand side, you can see here, there's the background measurement. And then in the gray here, you can see an impact window when the conscious observer has made his conscious or her consciousness effect on the system. You can see quite an interesting effect here in orders of magnitude. In orders of magnitude in terms of root mean square of the RMS impedance of the system. So in orders of magnitude of how much change is happening within the electrical conductivity or impedance within the system. It's interesting to know that conductivity and impedance are pretty much coefficients of each other. Let's see here. So moving on to the next slide. Is everybody good while I move on here into our second phase of the presentation? Very good. Okay, so, you know, coming together after some of our 10 years, a decade ago with some of those Emoto experiments and ceremony, you know, coming back with Lindsay and the Water Peace Project to like kind of bring a bigger voice to what we're doing with AquaPsy and at Cybertronica, you know, she really kind of, you know, inspired us to just, hey, let's reach a greater audience. Let's actually turn up the amplitude on reaching the public on what you guys are doing. So we decided to do a public experiment. So we came up with the Water Peace Project Collective Consciousness Water Experiment. And so that was conducted just recently on August 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's a reoccurring event that happens every month. Those are sacred numbers that were established by Dr. Masaru Emoto to always conduct those experiments on the 11th at 11 a.m. And so Lindsay's continued with that over the years. And so we decided to actually take AquaPsy, what she was doing in the water ceremonies, the technology from Cybertronica, and mash it all together and see what happens. So we set up an experiment online. We funneled most of the people into the Water Peace Project live feed. So we had a live experiment feed that was actually going on where people were influencing the water sample that you can see here in the left-hand corner. And also I was live mixing on my OBS software where you can live mix different images and stuff like that with this live sample in Germany. So there was a live sample. This is not the exact image. This is the only image I could find. But so I was cutting back and forth. So people were seeing the live sample in Germany and also the ceremony that we were conducting live and the actual live water sample here on the left-hand side. So we were basically entangling these systems together and building that feedback. And we were conducting our classic, you know, water ceremony protocol, which is essentially, you know, coming together and reciting a series of prayers that we had learned from each other, and also Masaru Emoto, one of them being the Oponopono Prayer. Here you can see pictured is Lindsay from the Water Peace Project. Here's myself from SVP Water Research and Aquaside and Cybertronica Research, and you have Anton Fedorenko, and you have Kumanga Andre Anaharedi, if I say that correctly, and she's from CALM, Center for, yeah, you know, I don't know, I have to look up real quick, if you can just hang in there with me. I just want to make sure I get all these right. Center for Advanced Learning of Meditation. So she brought together some really fun prayers for us to recite, and she kind of like brought that essence in from the universe. She's got a really strong connection to the spirit. And so we all came together in reverence with these prayers and with our backgrounds and gifts, and we connected to the audience at a distance throughout the web network, and we made an effect. And so let's explore those effects now. Before we do that, I want to discuss a little bit about the idea of a controlled environment, because any cogent scientist is going to want to see a lot of these corresponding measurements to see if the environmental parameters were actually balanced. And so that's what we're doing here. And we'll, at the end of this conversation, have Serge and Anton perhaps add a little bit of insight from a more technical perspective. But essentially we have our environmental conditions that were happening during the experiment. So within the laboratory, there's the spectrometer set up. And so here's your temperature dynamic. And so you see a pretty steady curve here in terms of temperature. There's no effect in terms of impact on the system. It's your average steady curve within the system. And what's interesting about that is there are some quantum dynamics here. Normally, you would think with an electrochemical reaction, there's also a thermodynamic reaction that's coefficiently happening within the system. But there's this, within this quantum entanglement dynamic, they're almost like isolated and separated from each other, which is really fascinating. So you'll see like a really steady temperature curve, but you'll see an effect electrochemically. So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later in maybe the questions and answers. These are the anomalies, the quantum anomalies. The RF power reading and sensor didn't pick up any cell phones. There was no like external magnetic fields influencing the system from the RF frequency domain. The sensor for the voltage supply within the circuitry essentially was pretty standard and steady. There wasn't any spikes or any kind of like spurious measurements during that environmental measurement. Air pressure, same thing. The M bar was pretty much its average expression here, and same with the magnetic field. And so the magnetometer and the accelerometer sensor readings were pretty stable. Within that being said, we could say that the experiment and the environmental conditions during the experiment were actually quite stable. And so we could say that if our experiment and our results are clean in terms of environmental corresponding measurements, then we're getting closer to saying that yes, it looks like we have made an effect here. So now let's look at the actual corresponding measurements to those environmental measurements that are corresponding with the impact in our experiment that we made during the water ceremony. And so here in the top row, you can see there's, let me zoom in. Okay, you can see that here there's a background measurement here. And so this background measurement has been taken over a series of hours where the system is quite balanced, it's quite saturated, and it's not having any kind of spurious measurements, a really balanced system. And so during the online experiment and the impact, we actually see that there's an effect. And so this is where the collective consciousness during the experiment is taking place. And so you can see now that the RMS magnitude is starting to express itself in orders of magnitude. So we're seeing an electrochemical reaction within the system. Now remember, when we saw the temperature readings in the environmental conditions, we didn't see the same type of dynamic. So like I said, so we would normally think that we would see on the temperature reading the same type of dynamic that we're seeing here within the electrochemical, but we're not. So this is an interesting discussion in terms of like quantum phenomena within the water systems, which has been a long discussion around the mechanism behind that. Could be the proton tunneling effect. There's quite a bit of research around proton tunneling within aqueous systems. And so that can be discussed on a further conversation. So this is the effect that we made here on the top left chart. Now, we also have a series of spectrometers in the same laboratory that are non-public, that we're actually taking measurements in correlation with the online sensors. And we were actually able to see an effect on the non-public spectrometer too, which does a couple things for us. It gives us insight that we have made an effect because we've seen a secondary effect on the system. So we can have data to correspond with and measure and say that, okay, if we saw an effect here and we see an effect here, okay, we're getting closer to seeing that we've made a real effect. But it also shows that there's that quantum entanglement dynamic that's happening within the water systems locally within the laboratory. And so that's a whole nother discussion that I'd like to bring up at the end of the conversation as well. So we're kind of building these questions of what are we experiencing with these quantum dynamics that are very anomalistic. But nonetheless, we made an effect. And what I want to also point out is what we're looking at in terms of a controlled experiment versus an experiment that has an effect is over the time domain. So here on the left-hand side, we've established a very stabilized background measurement, which is considered our control against an impacted measurement, which is, you're seeing an effect here. So that is our control. The left-hand side is our control, the right-hand side is our impact. So that's essentially how we're working around these quantum entanglement dynamics, is we really just decided to reduce it down to background measurement over time, impact, and then the post measurements. It's interesting in the post measurements, which I'll get to in a minute, that there's these latency effects. They're almost like fungibility of time. There's like these effect and time dynamics that are expressing themselves latent. And so the way I like to express that in a physical macroscopic analogy is like you drop a rock into a pond and the amplitude builds and then it settles down. And so it's almost like this latency reaction where you can see here on the targeted device, the public device, as we make the impact, the effect really starts to build post measurement. And so there's two things that actually are around that dynamic. Part of it is how the regression analysis takes into consideration the background measurement with the impact measurement. And then, so the number system expresses itself, I think, in that latent curve. But there's also this kind of causality time dynamic that's also occurring too, that, you know, going back to that coin term quantum dynamic, but there is something that's outside of the time domain, because we've seen sometimes this like fungibility where we see like a pre-impact that happens. We get like a reading right before the actual experiment happens, and sometimes after. So it's kind of these like weird spooky non-local phenomena, which we can talk about a little bit later. Now, to be fair, I'd like to hand this over to Anton. Are you there? Can you jump on with the microphone with me?
Hi, Jeremy. Hi, everyone.
So I'd like to have Anton discuss with you a little bit about how this is expressed in terms of the psi and the pro values, because he explains it a little bit more clear than I do. So please, Anton.
Bro, yeah, you can just keep your screen. So I will use this graphics. Yeah, so people who already used some functionality on the Aquaside platform, they know that in the end of the session, you receive one graph. Yeah, all this data you see now, Jeremy showed you, it's more detailed analysis of what happened on our group experiment. But usually on Aquaside platform, you see only one graph of that exact channel, which was a targeted channel during the session. And additional to that, you see two values. One of the value is psi value, or psi value, and another one is pro value. Psi value shows how strong was your effect during the session, but also what is most important is actually the pro value, because that shows you whether your effect was significant. Because even if you have large psi value, it doesn't mean that was caused by you. So we calculate the pro value, which is based on previous measurements. So because our device is recording 24 hours a day, we have all those previous passive sessions where nobody was influencing. And we see what kind of psi values were achieved in those passive sessions. and we compare your session with those previous sessions, and we see whether your psi value was higher or like lower or just somewhere in between them, and we based on that build a pro value. You see on these graphics here that Jeremy shows, it's a little bit like maybe complicated to explain how we like exactly build it, but we took the pro value of kind of showing pro values of the, I mean, like psi values of the previous sessions. This like top graphic on the left you see now, and we can see here that actually our psi value during the session is the highest that was achieved during like previous like 10 hours here is shown. But Serge also wrote here 24 hours because he has more data, and he calculated that this was the highest in previous 24 hours. And actually that showed that effect during the online experiment we did on 11th was we achieved a significant difference. And probably that was not just a random change in the sensor. Yeah, and to have even more statistics, we'll be conducting this experiment like next month and so on, each 11th. So then we can, you know, have all this data and doing more conclusions what was going on.
Thank you, Anton. We appreciate your time. So I think we're doing really good on time. So I'll just kind of make a few more points and kind of wrap it up for questions. But Serge, did you want to add anything to that? Did you want to discuss a little bit about like, you know, regression analysis in terms of how that plays into the measurements here? And do you want to speak at all at any of these dynamics from a PhD perspective?
Jeremy, I think everything is perfect. It's, we already talked a lot about this. I mean, it's...
Okay. Very good. So then I'll kind of walk us back into more of the layman's perspective here. So I'm going to stop share and I'm going to show you the Aquaside platform. All right, stand by. Google Chrome. I think this would do it. Yep, that's it. Okay. Let me see where we're at here. Okay, let me just do a quick refresh. Okay, so if you go to aquaside.com, you can see the experiment that we conducted on the 11th, and you can go to the results tab here, and you'll be able to see the graphs of which we've collected. And so what I want to discuss real quick is this whole idea around how we score. And so we averaged the psi value, which is the magnitude of effect, I believe, with the probability. And so if the lower the probability, the more likely that we made a true effect on the system. And so then that really gives us the level of score here on how maybe what we've done is we created a logic so like the average person can say, oh, did I actually make an effect? Yes, I could see it on the graph. And then what does that mean? So we've come up with like this way to score the dynamic. So people can kind of track their score and really kind of follow that logic. And so, I mean, just that's a whole fascinating conversation in itself, how to really take all this back-end data and package it up so someone, you know, that's just like a meditator or a healer can actually kind of wrap their head around it. And I think we've actually done a pretty cool job at that. So this is the actual graph happening during the experiment. Now, these are these post sessions that we start to take into account as well. And so you can start to see the magnitude is still expressing itself and the amplitude is still expressing itself post measurement. And so that's kind of like those latency effects. And so we have a series of post measurements here that you can also review in the results tab. And so the post measurements are really important for us. And so I guess really where we're going with this is, so yes, we can observe the effect, we can quantify the effect. How to characterize it is going to take a lot more data collection. And I think that's why the Aquaside platform is really cool, because we're just going to continuously start to continuously collect data to be able to understand and characterize how to measure and characterize what we're looking at. And so that's kind of a longer pathway, and we can talk a little bit more about that in question and answers. And I think I covered everything. Let me just check my slides one more time. Yeah, we covered everything. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes, so I thought we'd open it up for questions and answers. And thanks everybody for joining us. It's always great to talk about the sciences and the research.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Jeremy, many thanks for a very nice talk. Please, questions. I have 2 questions. First question, we in previous seminars, we had a lot of discussion about entanglement. And you said in torus stack, you also observed a lot of entanglement phenomena. Can you please tell, okay, what this phenomena are or was?
Well, essentially, the measurements, as we were taking them in like one-off measurements, we would notice entanglement between the 2 channels within the system. So then we would try to like control for that by putting the 2 different channels in copper chambers and ground them and try to create like a grounded controlled environment. And so that worked some of the time, but not all of the time. And so here's another fascinating thing I wanted to bring up. We also saw that during different types of moon cycles and lunar influences that we would see would affect the system as well. So that was also hard to control for. But what we ended up doing is we ended up just taking our series of 27 measurements and doing our whole experiment within a period of like 2 or 3 days to make sure that like if we were experiencing effects from the lunar cycles, everything was kind of done in one tight package that we could show a difference between control groups and affected groups. In terms of other entanglement phenomena, yeah, we noticed the conscious observer was having an effect on the experiment, and characterizing that is not so easy. I mean, it's like Eitztok Bentov would say in his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum. It's like this, it's like this tangibility, this fungibility that's hard to grab onto. Like the ether in the consciousness is always in like a flux. And so how do you control for that? It's a variable wave function. So I think the way to do that is to work the sciences of probability. And so that's what we're seeing here, like in like quantum computing and all these technologies and algorithms around superposition, and basically how to pin down a superposition measurement between ground state and charge state. And so it's all about the process of generating numbers and generating these probabilities and gathering enough n value. The more n value you can gather, then you can actually start to characterize and show a measurable effect. Hope that answered your question.
Did you say you observed a lunar cycle?
Yeah, we did. So our CTO, Scott Brown, he's awesome. Like he's a stickler. So like he made us like run background measurements. Like we had to run all these panels before we even decided to run the experiments to really see how the spectrometer was reacting, you know? And I just wanted to get to work. I just wanted to start measuring, but no, like we ran like all these continuous background measurements for like a month. And so we noticed when we were doing that, we saw it correlated with lunar cycles. And then, so we did it again. We saw it again. So I saw it personally, and we tracked enough data to where we could say that there was definitely effect from lunar cycles in terms of on the system. So that's pretty fascinating, considering, you know, the connections to microscopic, mesoscopic, and macroscopic. It kind of, it's all chained together, so to speak.
Did you perform any experiments during full moon, or you said okay, no experiments?
Okay. So I can't really speak on that specifically, but I do know within my crystallography experiments, which are pretty fascinating, I have been able to capture some anomalies on the full moon. Granted, I am utilizing some other scalar type technologies during my crystallography experiments, but it works best when I'm doing it during the full or new moons. And let me see if I can give you a quick taste of that. So here's a crystal that's captured at 200 times optical magnification. And so this is an icosahedral water crystal structure. And these aren't supposed to exist at 200 times optical. And so these are actually captured. I have a bifilar coil, which I create a wave conjugated magnetic field within an evapomethod crystallography experiment, where I take 72 trace mineral solution, aqueous solution. I do 5 drops on a slide, on a series of slides, and I let them anneal over time, over a 24-hour period. And I found that during the certain lunar cycles, the effect is a little bit more predominant and synergizes with these scalar field effects that I'm creating. And so I find it fascinating because I've spent a lot of time in the journals, crystallography journals, and I can't find anybody capturing these quasi-crystals at this optical scale. You know, all the Dan Schechtman work, all that stuff is done with like X-ray crystal diffraction, I think, and those are all just, you know, done on a much finer scale with the force microscopies. So yeah, so we're seeing, I mean, these kind of things have an effect. Look, here's a tetrahedra. I mean, have you guys ever seen a tetrahedra like that at 100 or 200 times optical? So it's this anomaly. I created an experiment. I still need to go back into all this work and turn it into science. Right now, this is me just like kind of expressing myself and halfway science, halfway intuition. But there's a science building around it, and probably in the next year or so, I'll start to kind of bring it together. And it definitely is connected to lunar cycle. But how I see that is it's aligning the wave function. You know, if you're aligning the macroscopic, if you're aligning the energy coming from the center of the sun to the center of the earth and back, you're lining up the wave function. And once all those angles of incidence are expressed in perfect equilibrium, additive and subtractive synthesis expresses itself, and you have access to these scalar fields. And so that's kind of the access to 0 point, or even the mind force field, undifferentiated mind force. And so that's where these anomalies happen. And so I don't know if that helps give some insight or answer any questions, but yeah. Anyways, any other questions?
Oh,
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, Jeremy. What about teasing out the Schumann from the lunar cycles? Can you do that? Can we look at that or differentiate?
Well, you can't really tease out the lunar cycle from the experiment. I mean, you can maybe conduct an experiment in like mu metal, like a type of shielded environment with mu metal, but even that, I don't think so. Maybe like very, very deep underground, where they conduct like all the neutrino experiments and stuff, you might be able to tease that out. But the Schumann resonance, I guess, to answer your question, Shelley, is actually part of the experiment. It's part of that wave function that is expressing itself within that dynamic. So if you're actually, by lining up that wave function within the experimental setup, you're actually kind of hitting that harmonic of what the Schumann resonance is doing. So yes, we do recognize that as being a part of the experiment.
Okay, thank you. And also thank you to Lindsay there in the chat for sending out those little prompts. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you guys join us, and just elaborating on the resonance, Jeremy, that's the whole purpose of everything, is that power, how it's building, and the sympathetic vibratory physics of it, how it builds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so to set up a very, very well organized resonance experiment, I like to talk about it in that whole additive synthesis idea of dominoes. So if you set up dominoes in harmonic succession and harmonic ratios, you only need a little bit of resonance or pressure right here to make a huge effect on the other side. And so that's the whole idea, lining up this wave function and these dynamics, and you can do all kinds of things, which, you know, I'm exploring now with some current technology.
Jeremy, I work currently with Professor Beverly Rubik from San Francisco. She is president of Psychedelic Society, and our current experiment was on my ability working on decompressing her spine, and they said that I break a couple of laws of physics. So my question is, I remember you mentioned there will be an equilibrium, there will be an energy in the ground. So I have a method that does that, gives the energy change to matter and gives the ground. I guess what I want to say, how the lunar cycle could affect that, and what, how can I apply aquaphysics as a form of I don't know if you have any type of equipment to change the crystals to give to a patient of mine to change the matter and their water content in their body, because I think that would be very healing. So do you have any downloads that I can recommend or anything like that? Do you do anything for physical health? Because you mentioned healing, and I wanted to see if that could be also complementary for my clients, patients.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so I think that's a two-part answer. So I'll take the second part real quick, and I'm gonna pass that off to Anton. So Anton has a project, and it was part of this original project that we worked with digital imprinting of homeopathy and homeopathic remedies in water, and that fits right into your question about, you know, different types of remedies to work on the body using water. And so yes, they are effective. There has been research around that, and Anton is the go-to person for that. So I would recommend that you connect with him for the healing aspect and for water.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then in terms of understanding how to line up the wave function, so it's pretty simple physics. So if you understand, like, you know, the moon, the lunar cycles are pushing and pulling the water on the planet, right?
Yes.
So if you're going to do an adjustment on somebody, you think of it like a tension on a wire. You're not going to want to do the adjustment when the system's in high tension. You're not going to want to do an adjustment when the system is low tension, but you're going to want to find that perfect resonance and balance where you can have the most effect on that system. I guess, for example, if you're doing like a spinal adjustment. So yes, I imagine you could correlate the lunar cycles and the type of push and pull that's happening within that dynamic to find the equilibrium and the best time to affect a body. Now, that comes with to say that not everybody's in resonance with the lunar cycles, you know what I'm saying? So everybody's on their own clock, so to speak. So that's up to
My
you.
method does not require any physical contact whatsoever, but your tissues get aligned and everything. So I was thinking applying that or having, okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so as a practitioner, I guess maybe you could start to unify and get them their clock closer to the natural clock, but it's all up to you to kind of know how to work with the wave function, you know, within that biology. I don't know if that made sense.
That does make sense. That's where the science merges with the art. Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I've kind of gone in and out of the whole medical stuff and healing stuff, but like I kind of like found a pathway towards like more applied technologies. Right now we're doing water remediation. I'm using plasma, and I generate these like reactive species to basically affect water, to do like water remediation. And so I'm trying to find like these real strong physiochemical reactions that I can like quantify and measure, and we can actually like, you know, enter into, you know, products, goods and services in the industry where, you know, we can take some of this quantum ether science and actually bring it forward into applying it into the real world. And so that takes an art and a bridge, and you got to find where that balance is. And so I respect both sides because I come from the intuitive, you know, I'm an empath and I'm a, you know, I come from that world, but like I'm always trying to look towards like the quantifiable and tangible and how to bridge that gap. Any other questions?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
That was excellent, Jeremy. I just wanted to add one thing, not to drag it out, but you know, that's what Dr. Emoto got started with. You know, he met Dr. Lawrence Simpson in Southern California, and he was doing homeopathic work when he purchased that magnetic resonance analyzer. And he was actually doing what this gentleman's saying. I mean, it's different, but through water, imprinting the water and doing like kind of like a biofeedback, scanning the patient for what they needed and imprinting the water with that and doing that. And that's what really brought Anton and I's resonance together. I was really super fascinated with what they were doing with imprinting using pharmaceutical type of information and not using chemicals, and also fascinated with what you're doing with the plasma energy, also changing water in a way, in a non-chemical fashion. So these things are really going to transform our humanity. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for being an inspiration for all these years. I appreciate it.
Your mind person also, thanks.
Lindsay and Jeremy, just a question to this, let's say, water imprinting technology. Is there any resistance in US on this technology?
I've decided a few years back to not even comment on that anymore.
Okay.
I went far enough down that rabbit hole to know to just leave it to the professionals. Anton.
So I think it's all depends how you talk about it. It's FDA has its own like rules, and so far we know if you just don't call it maybe like healing all the stuff, you put right disclaimer on your website, and just people know, you kind of just unofficially tell them, yeah, it's what it is, and they understand they have to read the disclaimer, and it would go under category as just wellness devices or something like that, and so far it's okay. And how we store the signals, we store them in form of like sound files, and some people in Germany, we have lots of people from Germany using them, and they were consulting with different lawyers, etc. And those lawyers said like, oh, if they would need to say they cannot use this informational signals, then they have to prohibit all the music in the world. So they will not be able to do that, and that's
Dear
why.
Lord.
Sorry?
I was just going to add to that question, Serge, is we do have homeopathic remedies here, which, like I said, Dr. Emoto first was inspired in Southern California. So, it is being used, but how it's used and how people view that application, and I guess all these sciences are going to really transform that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what we should do is I want to really kind of hold up the water conference. So the conference on the physics, chemistry, and biology of water is kind of like, the seed of all of us and how we all came together. And that's chaired by Gerald H. Pollack, and it's attended by many great researchers such as Luc Montagnier and many others. And so a lot of that research is made open source on waterconf.org, waterconf.org. Abstracts, PowerPoints, all these different presentations exploring very scientifically all of these questions. And so it's kind of like that boundary condition where all the information exchange is happening is there. So I want to hold that up into the light, and just let you guys know to go there. And one other thing, so with the whole digital imprinting technology, essentially, like when Anton is creating an electromagnetic field around a substance, he's creating like a white noise signal. And this white noise is kind of like this quantum coherent domain. It's very similar to the quantum domains that are happening within the water dynamics, these quantum domains. And so if you look up a paper by, Alberto Tedeschi on holographic white resonance, he talks a little bit about that and the whole idea around coherent domains and how like water can actually receive and transmit information. And that group actually did a lot of work with Luc Montagnier. Those experiments have been replicated. I mean, it's real. And if you really want to get into the whole history of it in terms of like where all those conversations came from, if you're not, aside from all the good all the amazing Russian research, but if you want to just like kind of see where it kind of picked up in terms of like conventional, is go into the work of Jacques Benveniste. And there was a huge blow up around, the Nature journal publishing the work of like digital imprinting and this ability to have these type of technologies in the conventional science. And it's too bad that he wasn't around to see where we're at now, because we've come a long way, and he was on the right path. And so the water conference, I think, carries on that whole lineage. Any other questions?
Hi, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Hi, Igor.
Yeah,
Nice to see you.
I am Laguna Beach.
Yeah, Laguna Beach.
Nice place. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we finally got a little heat wave here.
for almost 30 years. I had my biotech company in Carlsbad, California. Yeah. So I know this area very, very well. Okay. In terms of, you mentioned about your, I don't know, former current contact with Masaru Emoto, because I visited his lab in Tokyo for a couple times. We were doing an experiment with our water technology. So I knew very well Masaru Emoto, and just a little bit, just kind of like a small announcement that, you know, that Masaru Emoto passed about 3 years ago. So his son, Hiro Emoto, we have a very good contact right now. And my associate in Singapore, Vincent Sid, Dr. Vincent Sid, he's kind of like a mentor for Hiro Emoto right now. So I think they're gonna organize a new water conference with Hiro Emoto in Hawaii, probably January, February next year. It's a water conference, and well, everybody expect you know, huge crowd. So just kind of like announcement. And actually, what you mentioned about your experiment with your technology related to the, you know, water effects and everything. So basically, we have same type of experiments, and we have exactly, you know, very close results, if it's possible to say, you know. I think everything is based on the so-called water memory effect, which was based on the idea of the clathrate structure of the water, which was actually proposed by Dr. Pollock in 1959. So that's the basis for water to remember the effects, including physical effect or electromagnetic. Any agent can affect water, obviously. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Igor. Yes, it shows you kind of the extensive research that's kind of going on globally, and a lot of the research and the results are kind of like, you know, crossing over, and it just shows you that the work is tangible, and the pathway forward is kind of open. And yeah, and even way back into Gilbert Ling's work, you know, I think we all know about Gilbert Ling's work, and also before that, people have been doing crystallography experiments and water experiments. So it's fascinating to see kind of the evolution of everything. And I think it's all about, you know, the pathway forward and the next generations, and disseminating all of this knowledge for the future, so they can take it into the next iteration and expand upon it.
Hello, Jeremy. Are there any explanations for this delay of the effect?
Oh yeah, okay. So I think I'm going to give this to Serge, because he can tell you a little bit about how the algorithms and regression analysis plays into that. But that still doesn't get around the fact that there's still like a physical quantum dynamic of how the wave function expresses itself. But so let me pull up a video real quick while Serge, maybe you can take us through the regression analysis and how the numbers kind of work into the graph. And then I'm going to pull up a video real quick while you do that.
Well, delay, it's a difficult question. I mean, normally we say, well, there is impact and immediately we should see some response. But normally there is some, let's say, effects on electrochemistry. There's some unknown X factor. We had a seminar yesterday and we discussed a lot about it. X factor. In fact, we don't know too much about this X factor, how it's work, what are dependencies. So, and we just say, well, there is an impact window, and we look for a strong correlation between impact within these impact windows, and whatever is before or after, we just discard. It's a main story. And the second story, because of this numerical analysis, we can observe a kind of post effect. As in the first line is a purely numerical effect, and then we record 2 post sessions just to see whether in the post session impact is higher than in the original sessions. So from this point of view, I mean, delay The typical delay is 5 to 10 minutes, and probably we could have a kind of, in the post section, about half of hour of delay. That's most what we normally observe. Jeremy, your mic is...
Change my audio settings. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's very clear.
Okay. Well, then I don't know how to set my internal audio settings on the fly here, but I'm just going to show you the video anyways. So basically, it's the tuning fork phenomena. When you have two tuning forks in resonance, you can hit one and the other one will resonate at a distance, right? So that's the dynamic that I'm going to show you. But in this case, what we're going to see is how the amplitude builds from the initial point of impact in a latency effect. So I'm going to offer that up as a macroscopic analogy, physical analogy for what we might be seeing electrochemically in the conscious observer feedback. So let me just do that really quick. If you don't hear the audio, just imagine that the two tuning forks are in tune. Okay, you guys can still hear me, right? Okay, here we go. So from what I've known, I've done a lot of experiments in a lot of different setups, and from what I understand about physics is physics. And so I like to offer that up as an analogy for like the latency effect that we might be seeing in the electrochemical setup. So I don't know if that gave any kind of a insight. You can see that it was struck and then the amplitude built over time.
So I see we've gone over our 15 minutes, but I just have one last question with regard to this latency idea, and that is, do you find more coherence? I mean, I'm guessing you would find more coherence with each signal. So in other words, a cumulative from the researcher, from even just these experiments on the Water Peace Project or the Aquaside project. Has it become stronger and more, coherent in that signal?
Yeah, so I guess what you're saying is like if the more coherent the observer or the more amplitude in the crowdsource, like if you have more people affected or affecting the experiment, if we're seeing more or less amplitude. Qualitatively, yes, we would like to say that, but if you really want to get into the science of this, it's going to take collecting of a lot more data to really make a strong answer and give you a strong answer and have a correlation. So yeah, that's like would be like the holy grail of being able to quantify that. But for example, like if we were able to get enough measurements and set up enough controlled experiments to where we can see a characterization within what you're asking, then like someone like Serge could go in and build an algorithm to like cancel out as much noise and variability to actually account for like, you know, praying love versus praying hate or something, you know what I'm saying? So this is what will come in the future as we start to characterize these experiments. Then you can actually start to tease out more resolution. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answered or helps give any insight.
A little bit, but I was really thinking more the entanglement of say a common core of people, as opposed to numbers. in other words, consciousness expressing through the same people each time becomes more coherent, or does it not?
Well, yeah, I mean, qualitatively, I think we can all say that is like, in terms of like, for example, you, Shelley, I think you've done a lot of research and tracking that qualitatively over time and working with your clients and probably amassing a lot of that quality data. And so how do you translate that into numbers, into an actual experiment that's done electrochemically, that's then translated into an algorithm that's expressed numerically? You know what I'm saying? It has to go through the filter of how we're going about measuring the system. Hope that answered your question or gave you some insight. Those are hard questions.
Okay. Okay. Any more questions to Jeremy? Oh, Jeremy, I really enjoyed your talk. Great. Just a short announcement about next seminar. Next seminar, we will have speaker Konstantin Karatkov, well-known Kirlian effect. This device from Konstantin, that was one of the first on the market. Currently, it's a well-known technology with a lot of results, and we invited him to speak here about consciousness and all this, let's say, result what they obtained with another technology, not with electrochemistry. So to have very different devices here in the seminar. Okay, then many thanks everybody for coming. Then see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.